It was past midnight when Mrs. Hargrove, a widow who lived 2 houses down from Maria Thompson, first heard it. At first she thought it was the wind, a faint wail carried through the stillness of the suburban night. But as she sat by her window, unable to sleep, the sound grew louder. It wasn't the wind. It was a child. No, more than one, crying. The noise was faint yet persistent, like a ghostly plea for help. She pressed her ear to the wall, her heart racing as she realized the cries were coming from Maria Thompson's house. "What in the world?" she muttered, clutching her robe tightly. The sound made her uneasy, creeping into her thoughts and refusing to let go. Finally, she grabbed her phone and dialed 931 2 times to listen, then returned it to the pocket of her sleeve. It was 8 o'clock, and the operator answered with a calm yet professional tone. 911, what's your emergency? Mrs. Hargrove's voice trembled. I think something's wrong at my neighbor's house. Maria Thompson. I keep hearing children crying. From the attic, I think. She lives alone with her kids, but it doesn't seem right. It's been going on for hours. Ma'am, are you certain the sounds are coming from inside the house? Yes, I'm sure of it, she insisted, her unease turning to panic. Please just send someone. Something's not right. We're dispatching officers now. Stay indoors and remain safe. Mrs. Hargrove hung up, her hands trembling. She stood by the window, staring at the dark silhouette of Maria's house, waiting for the police to arrive. Minutes later, flashing blue and red lights illuminated the quiet cul-de-sac. 2 patrol cars pulled up to Maria's driveway. The officers, dressed in dark uniforms, stepped out cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the night. Neighbors peeked through curtains, their curiosity piqued by the commotion. Maria's house loomed dark and silent, its once welcoming facade now foreboding. "Doesn't look like anyone's home," one officer said. His partner frowned. "Someone's home. We'll find out soon enough." The officers knocked on the front door. "Police, open up!" Silence greeted them. They knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. Shining their flashlights around the perimeter, they noticed the windows were boarded up, the curtains drawn tight. One officer jiggled the doorknob, finding it locked. "We're going in," he said, pulling a crowbar from his belt. As the door gave way, the smell hit them first. Stale air, mildew, and something faintly metallic. The officers exchanged a wary glance before stepping inside. Schuyler and the other 2 stepped inside. The house was eerily still, the only sound the officers' boots creaking against the wooden floor. As they moved through the rooms, they found signs of neglect: dust-covered furniture, piles of dishes in the sink, and a shattered photo frame on the floor. Then they heard it. Faint, pitiful cries coming from above. Flashlights in hand, they climbed the narrow staircase leading to the attic. The door was bolted. "Police, step back," one officer shouted before breaking it down. Inside, 3 children huddled together, their faces pale and gaunt. They flinched at the sudden burst of light. The room was cramped with no windows, only a bare mattress and a single blanket. The air was suffocating. "Jesus Christ," one officer muttered. "Kids, it's okay. We're here to help." The oldest, a boy barely in his teens, clung to his younger sisters. His voice was hoarse. Don't hurt us, please." As the children were carried out, Maria Thompson appeared at the bottom of the stairs, her face void of emotion. She watched as the officers led her children away. "Mrs. Thompson," one officer began, "can you explain what's going on here?" She remained silent, her expression unreadable. "You understand you're in serious trouble, right?" Finally she spoke, her voice soft but firm. "I did what I had to do." Outside, as the children were placed into waiting ambulances, neighbors gathered, murmuring in shock and disbelief. School its context. Sequence, first inaugurage. What kind of mother does this? One whispered. Another shook her head. I always thought she was strange, but this is evil. The officers exchanged glances as they escorted Maria to the patrol car. There was something unsettling about her calm demeanor, as if she didn't regret a thing. Act the part, the man asked Maria. Where are the women and where are the men? This isn't over, one officer said grimly. Something tells me we've only scratched the surface. As the car doors closed behind Maria, the night silence returned, heavier than before, shrouding the neighborhood in an eerie stillness. The truth about Maria Thompson was only beginning to unravel. Maria Thompson once radiated joy, the embodiment of a devoted wife and mother. Her life revolved around David, her high school sweetheart and loving husband, and their 3 children, Jacob, Emily, and Sarah. Theirs was a home filled with laughter, Sunday dinners, and plans for the future. That perfect world came crashing down one rainy November evening. David never made it home from work. A semi-truck lost control on the highway, smashing into his sedan. The news shattered Maria. Grief consumed her, leaving her a shell of the woman she once was. The warmth that once defined her life turned cold, and her ability to move forward vanished. Maria's grief isolated her. Friends and family tried to console her, but their words felt hollow. She stopped answering calls, missed gatherings, and retreated into the only solace she knew: her children. Her once meticulous routines fell apart. Laundry piled up, dishes went untouched, and the days blurred into one another. Her children noticed the change. Jacob, only 12, watched his mother sit for hours staring out the window, tears streaming silently down her face. One evening, Emily approached her. "Mommy, are you okay?" she asked, her small hand reaching for Maria's. Maria grimaced. "We were there when they called 911. So bad you can't see." Maria's voice was faint, her words disjointed. "I'm fine, baby. Everything is fine." But Emily could see the lie behind her mother's hollow eyes. Jacob took on the role of protector. At 12, he became a surrogate parent to Emily and Sarah, comforting them when Maria withdrew into her grief. He fixed their breakfasts, walked them to school, and made sure they bathed. Emily, curious and empathetic at 8, tried to keep the family together. She scribbled pictures of the family in happier times, leaving them on her mother's nightstand in hopes of sparking a smile. 6-year-old Sarah, the baby of the family, retreated into silence. She clung to a battered stuffed rabbit, seeking comfort in its threadbare softness. The children, though loyal to Maria, began to feel the weight of her absence. The Thompson home, once a hub of activity, became eerily quiet. Neighbors whispered about Maria's absence from block parties and PTA meetings. The truth was, Maria didn't come home much. Mrs. Hargrove, the ever-watchful widow next door, commented one afternoon. She used to wave every morning. Now, the blinds are always drawn. Mercy opened the back door and crept down the stairs. She climbed to the topmost floor and looked down around her. Others noticed the house falling into disrepair, the overgrown lawn, the broken porch light, the stack of unopened mail by the door. "Something's not right in there," a neighbor murmured, her voice tinged with concern. As months turned into years, Maria's grief transformed into something darker. News of local crimes, a break-in 2 blocks away, reports of child abductions on TV, fed her growing fear. One evening, she turned off the television with a snap, her hands trembling. This world isn't safe for children, she muttered to herself. Maria began homeschooling her kids, pulling them out of school abruptly. It's for your own good, she explained to Jacob when he protested. You don't understand how dangerous it is out there. What began as an act of love turned into suffocating control. Maria bolted the windows and installed heavy locks on the doors. She convinced herself that the outside world was a threat, and she was the only one who could protect her children. Colette, Mom, why can't we go outside? Emily asked one morning. Maria's voice was calm, but her words carried an edge. Outside is dangerous. I won't let anything happen to you. You'll understand when you're older. Jacob clenched his fists at her words, but said nothing, biting back the urge to argue. Jakob's resentment grew as he watched his sisters adapt to their confined life. Emily tried to maintain a fragile peace, smoothing over conflicts and reassuring Sarah. I just want to play with other kids, Sarah whispered one night, clutching her rabbit. Ah. Jacob knelt beside her, his voice a mixture of anger and sorrow. I know, Sarah. I do too. He glanced toward the locked door, the weight of their isolation pressing down on him. The once vibrant Thompson household became a prison. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. The sound of laughter was replaced by silence, broken only by Maria's stern instructions or the soft hum of a television in the background. Maria believed she was saving her children, but in reality she was losing them, and herself. The seeds of the tragedy that would soon unfold had already been sown, waiting to take root in the shadows of her broken home. Maria had always been cautious, but the world felt darker after David's death. News of a nearby home invasion sent her spiraling into a state of constant anxiety. A young mother had been attacked while her children slept upstairs. Maria couldn't shake the image. If disaster happened here, it'll happen nowhere else. The defenseless mother ran from home, her children slept upstairs. Maria had always been cautious, but the world felt darker after David's death. She stood in the kitchen, gripping a coffee mug so tightly her knuckles whitened. The sound of the television in the next room narrated the horrific details. It could happen here, she whispered. When Jacob walked in, her voice sharpened. You're not leaving this house alone anymore. Do you understand me? Jacob raised an eyebrow. Mom, I'm 13. I can walk to the store by myself. Not anymore, she snapped, her tone final. The changes came gradually. First, she withdrew the kids from school, claiming she could educate them better at home. Then, she stopped allowing them to play outside. Windows were bolted shut, and the doors were locked at all times. Mom, why can't I go to Jimmy's house? Emily asked one afternoon. Maria bent down, her hands gripping Emily's shoulders. Because it's dangerous out there, sweetheart. People can hurt you. It's safer here, with me. Emily didn't argue. Her mother's eyes, once warm, now carried a frantic intensity that frightened her. Maria's stories became darker with time. She spoke of kidnappers lurking in the shadows and strangers who couldn't be trusted. The children, young and impressionable, listened with wide eyes. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Jacob couldn't hold back any longer. Mom, no one's trying to kidnap us. You're making this up. Maria's face hardened. You don't understand, Jacob. The world is full of monsters. If you leave this house, you'll see for yourself, and by then, it'll be too late. Jacob pushed his plate away, anger boiling under his skin. Maybe I'd rather take my chances. Jacob's rebellion grew louder with each passing day. He began sneaking to the attic, to peer through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. The sunlight was a painful reminder of the freedom they no longer had. One afternoon, he confronted Maria directly. This isn't normal, Mom. You're keeping us prisoners. Maria's voice trembled with anger. I'm keeping you safe. No, you're not. You're just scared, and now we're all paying for it, he fired back, storming out of the room. In the corner, Emily and Sarah watched silently, their mother's eyes burning with tears she refused to let fall. Emily, always the mediator, approached Maria that evening. Mom, maybe Jacob's right. Maybe we could go outside sometimes. Maria turned to her, disbelief etched across her face. You, too? I just think maybe we don't need to be this scared all the time. Emily said carefully, choosing her words like walking a tightrope. Maria shook her head. You're too young to understand. One day, you'll thank me for protecting you. While Jacob fought and Emily mediated, Sarah withdrew completely. She clutched her rabbit tightly, her small voice barely audible when she spoke. One evening, Emily found her sitting in the corner of the attic. Sarah, what are you doing up here? She lay in bed for a long time, restless. At last, she slipped into a deep sleep and fell right back into it. I'm waiting, Sarah said softly. Waiting for what? For it to stop, Sarah replied, her eyes distant and unblinking. Outside, the Thompson home drew attention. Mrs. Hargrove, ever observant, noticed Maria's car rarely left the driveway. The once pristine garden was now overrun with weeds. Have you seen Maria lately? She asked a neighbor during a chance encounter. Maria came to spend the intervening days quietly. No, and those kids? I haven't seen them in months, the other replied, a note of unease in her voice. At night, faint noises came from the house, muffled cries or the thud of something heavy. The neighbors whispered, but did nothing. Inside the house, the strain was unbearable. Jacob's defiance reached its peak one evening when he tried to force the front door open. Maria caught him in the act. What are you doing? She screamed, grabbing his arm. Trying to get out. We don't belong in here, he shouted back, his voice cracking. Emily stood between them, her hands raised. Stop, both of you, please. But it was too late. The fragile threads holding the family together had snapped, and the house that Maria thought was her sanctuary had become a battleground. The stage was set for a tragedy that no one could stop. The night was eerily silent, save for the rhythmic scratching of pencil on paper. Jacob sat cross-legged on the dusty attic floor, his face illuminated by a weak flashlight. His sisters were asleep on the bare mattress behind him, their shallow breathing the only other sound in the oppressive stillness. Strange, she mused, to sit up so long without taking a breath, so nervous with sleep, so fragile on the brink of crisis. His hand trembled as he wrote, the words coming in frantic bursts. Help us, we're trapped, please get us out. Maria Thompson's house, 223-310 Maple Drive. He folded the note carefully and slipped it into his pocket. His heart pounded as he made his way downstairs, each creak of the floorboards threatening to betray him. At the front door, he slid the note beneath the crack, hoping someone would find it. As he crept back to the attic, he whispered a silent prayer. She glanced back over her shoulder and saw his fear in her eyes now. She paused. As he pressed the note between the crack, hoping someone would find it in the dark, he whispered a silent prayer. Mrs. Hargrove spotted the scrap of paper on her morning walk, its edges fluttering in the breeze. Frowning, she bent to pick it up, her brow furrowing as she read the desperate plea. "Oh, dear Lord," she gasped, her hand flying to her chest. Without hesitation, she hurried back to her house. dialing 911 with shaking fingers. "There's something terribly wrong at the Thompson house," she told the dispatcher, her voice trembling. "You need to send someone immediately." Red and blue lights reflected off the windows of the quiet cul-de-sac. A team of officers surrounded the house, their movements precise and deliberate. "Police, open the door!" one officer shouted, pounding on the front door. The house remained silent. After several unanswered knocks, the lead officer nodded. "Breach it." The sound of the door splintering echoed through the neighborhood. Inside, the air was thick, heavy with a stifling stillness. The officers moved through the rooms methodically, their flashlights cutting through the shadows. "Upstairs," one of them muttered, catching the faint sound of movement. The tension was palpable as they ascended. The officers reached the attic door, finding it locked from the outside. "Stand back," one of them ordered, forcing the door open with a crowbar. The inside of the attic was large and dark, and held the lights and cameras within clusters as the group dug deeper. Inside, the scene was harrowing. Jacob, Emily, and Sarah huddled together, their faces pale and gaunt. The air was suffocating, and the children flinched at the intrusion, shielding their eyes from the sudden light. "Kids, you're safe now," one officer said gently, lowering his weapon. Jacob's voice was barely a whisper. "Is it over?" The officer nodded, his throat tightening as he took in the room's barren conditions. "Yes, son. It's over." Downstairs, Maria sat on the living room sofa, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She didn't flinch as the officers entered. "Mrs. Thompson, stand up," one of them instructed. She rose slowly, her expression serene, as though she'd been expecting this moment. "Do what you need to," she said simply. As she was led outside, the cacophony of flashing lights, hushed whispers, and the sight of her children being carried away did nothing to break her composure. Jacob walked beside the officer, escorting him to an ambulance. He glanced over his shoulder at Maria, his face a mix of anger and pain. Their eyes met briefly, but neither spoke. His silence was louder than any words, a bitter condemnation of the woman who had claimed to protect him. In the sterile confines of the interrogation room, Maria sat across from two detectives. Her tone was calm, almost detached, as she explained her actions. "I kept them safe," she said firmly. "The world is full of predators, corruption, and chaos. I did what any mother would do." The lead detective frowned. "You locked your children in an attic for years. Do you call that safety? Call that safety escape for them, not some terrorist attack on the big city." The voice came again, this time with a familiar command to stillness. Maria's expression didn't waver. "It's better than letting them become victims. You can't understand. No one can," he said. Finally, later, Jacob was allowed a supervised visit with Maria. He stood on the other side of the glass, his fists clenched at his sides. "Why, Mom?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "Why did you do this to us?" Maria's calm facade faltered. "I did it for you," she said softly. "No," he shot back, his eyes brimming with tears. "You did it for yourself. You were scared, and we paid the price." Her voice broke as she whispered, "I thought I was saving you." Jacob shook his head, the weight of years of confinement crashing down on him. "You didn't save us, you destroyed us." News of the case spread like wildfire. Media outlets dissected every detail, from the children's malnourished state to Maria's eerie composure. "Is she a monster or a victim?" one anchor asked during a primetime special. The public remained divided. Some saw Maria as a deranged abuser, while others argued she was a fragile woman driven to extremes by her own fears. The town of Leavenworth, Mississippi, As the headlines continued, the Thompson children faced the daunting task of rebuilding their lives, their story etched into the nation's consciousness as a haunting reminder of love twisted into obsession. The social worker opened the door to the group home, ushering Jacob, Emily, and Sarah inside. The air smelled of cleaning products, and the faint hum of conversation echoed down the hallway. "This will be your home for now," the woman said gently, her voice kind but distant. Jacob clutched Sarah's hand tightly, his jaw set in a defiant line. Emily stayed close, her eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings. "It's different here," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Emily knelt down, her hands resting on Sarah's shoulders. "It's okay, Sarah. We're together. That's what matters." But Jacob's silence betrayed his own struggle. The world beyond the attic, once his dream, now felt impossibly vast and unforgiving. Late that night, Jakob sat alone on the edge of his bunk bed, staring at the note he had written, the one that had set everything in motion. He clenched it tightly, his mind a storm of conflicting emotions. Relief that his sisters were safe, rage at the years stolen from them, and guilt, gnawing, relentless guilt. Emily approached, her steps cautious. "Jacob?" He didn't look up. "I betrayed her, Em. No matter what she did, she's still our mom." "She betrayed us first," Emily replied, her voice steady. "You did what you had to. For us. For Sarah. And so," Jacob's hands trembled, the paper crumpling in his grip. "Then why does it feel like I broke everything?" Emily became the glue holding them together. When Sarah cried at night, Emily sang softly to her, stroking her hair until she fell asleep. "You're so strong, Em," Jacob said one morning, watching her help Sarah tie her shoes. She smiled faintly. "Someone has to be." But inside, Emily carried her own ache. She missed their mother, despite everything. She yearned for the moments before their world collapsed, before the fear, the isolation, the lies. And she missed her husband, who used to hang out with her and the kids. Sarah, too young to fully understand their ordeal, struggled to trust anyone outside her siblings. When the house mother offered her a plate of cookies, Sarah recoiled, hiding behind Jacob. "I don't want it," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. "It's okay, Sarah," Jacob said softly. "They're not gonna hurt you." But she only shook her head, clutching her stuffed rabbit as though it were her lifeline. The scars of their captivity ran deep, and Sarah's innocence had been the first casualty. Maria's trial became a media spectacle. Headlines splashed her image across screens and newspapers, calling her everything from a monstrous abuser to a tragic victim of her own mind. In the courtroom, Maria sat rigid, her expression blank. Reporters whispered as the prosecution painted her as a manipulative woman who had robbed her children of their lives. The defense, however, argued a different story. "Maria Thompson is a woman undone by grief," her attorney declared. "She acted out of love, not malice. Her mind was her prison, just as much as her children were hers." The gallery watched in silence, divided and uncertain. When Jacob took the stand, the room held its breath. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed the pain behind his words. "She wasn't always like this," he began. "Before my dad died, she was happy. She loved us. But after he was gone, everything changed." He paused, his throat tightening. "She told us she was protecting us, but it didn't feel like protection. It felt like we were trapped. And I loved her. I still do. But what she did to us, it wasn't love. She slaughtered the memory of our birth, and Maria's gaze remained fixed on him, her composure unbroken, but a tear slipped down her cheek. Outside the courthouse, neighbors gathered in clusters, their conversations tinged with guilt and disbelief. "We should have seen the signs," Mrs. Hargrove murmured, shaking her head. "The boarded windows, the way she kept to herself. How did we miss it?" Another neighbor sighed. "Sometimes people don't want to see what's right in front of them." The once idyllic suburb now bore the weight of a dark secret, its residents haunted by their failure to intervene. When the trial ended, the siblings stood outside the courthouse, their futures uncertain. Jacob glanced at Emily and Sarah, his resolve hardening. She glanced at him with a stern look, then led the way to the guardroom. "We'll get through this," he said firmly. Emily nodded, her hand resting on Sarah's shoulder. "We will. Together." But even as they walked away, the shadow of their past loomed over them. The scars Maria had left were invisible but deep, a constant reminder of a love that had turned into a prison. And though the world had opened to them at last, it carried with it the weight of rebuilding what had been lost. Maria's love for her children was undeniable, yet it was that same love, warped by fear, that imprisoned them. Her actions blurred the delicate line between safeguarding her family and controlling them. Jacob had once asked her, "How is this protecting us, Mom? You're the one hurting us now." Maria's response still echoed in his mind. "You'll understand one day, Jacob. You'll see I did this because I love you." But love, when mixed with unchecked paranoia, had turned into a weapon. Her intent to protect had spiraled into obsessive control, severing her children from the world they deserved to know. Every day she feared her children fell, and this was no accidental. Maria's withdrawal from the community didn't happen overnight. It began with skipped neighborhood gatherings, unanswered calls, and eventually, complete solitude. She convinced herself the world outside was too dangerous, a toxic environment she needed to shield her children from. Mrs. Hargrove had noticed the shift. "She was such a friendly woman," she'd told a reporter. Then, one day, it was like she disappeared. "I should have knocked on her door." But she wasn't there, and she never returned, not even the day they found her in the pastoral camp. Maria's isolation fed her paranoia, creating an echo chamber where every fear multiplied. With no one to challenge her perspective, her judgment became increasingly distorted, leading her down a path from which she couldn't turn back. Maria's grief after David's death was profound, but it went unacknowledged by those around her. Friends had offered casseroles and fleeting condolences, but failed to see the depth of her pain. Her health terror, her last interviews, and the days before David died still preyed on her mind. She needed help, Jacob said during an interview years later. Not just someone to check on her, but real help, therapy, medication, something to pull her out of that darkness. Instead, her untreated trauma became a festering wound, shaping every decision she made. Society's failure to recognize her struggle left Maria to battle her demons alone, and in her isolation, she lost herself and her children in the process. Despite the years of confinement, Jacob, Emily, and Sarah found ways to endure. Emily's creativity and Jacob's determination kept them going, while Sarah's quiet resilience allowed her to hold on to hope, however faint. Jacob once told Emily, "No matter what happens, we stick together. That's how we survive." Their bond became their anchor, a source of strength that carried them through even the darkest moments. As they began to heal, their determination to rebuild their lives became a testament to the human spirit's capacity for recovery, even in the face of unimaginable adversity. The Thompson case left the community grappling with difficult questions. How had no one noticed the signs? Could someone have intervened before it was too late? During a town meeting, one resident stood and asked, "What do we do if this happens again? How do we make sure we're paying attention?" The tragedy highlighted the cracks in the social fabric, how easily vulnerable individuals could slip through them. It begged a haunting question. Was Maria a villain? Or was she a product of a society that failed to support her when she needed it most? As the children moved forward, the town was left with a painful reminder of the thin line between love and obsession, and the responsibility shared by a community to protect not just its children, but its struggling parents as well.